A burning car has rammed into the home of a Parisian mayor after a fifth day of violent protests across France. The mayor called the attack an assassination attempt of unspeakable cowardice, which left his wife and one of his children injured.
In an unassuming suburban act of shocking violence, a burning car driven straight at the home of the town's mayor in the early hours. He wasn't there, but his wife and young children were, and they were forced to flee. His wife suffered a broken leg. The house was ransacked, their car destroyed. The mayor, Vincent Jeanbrun, was today visited by the Prime Minister, Elizabeth Borne. She said she was shocked by what had happened. The Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, who's led the response to the violence, was another visitor. Mr. Jeanbrun emerged this afternoon, clearly exhausted and traumatised by his experience. He walked round his town, accepting the good wishes of locals. He told them his wife wouldn't be walking for 3 months. He visited an indoor market that had been vandalised during the past few days, persevering with his job, even though he's become an unwilling focus.
Well, Vincent Jeanbrun does look fearful and scared. Now, lots of people over the past few days have been victims of looting and rioting, but what happened to him and his family was different. It was a targeted, premeditated attack. It was personal.
The woman standing by him during this visit, one of the heavyweights of the mayor's Republican Party.
The world is watching France at the moment and doesn't understand what is happening. What is your message to the watching world about your nation?
I am confident that violence will decrease in the following days. All the troops, the forces are on the field and working on building a new security in the region.
France has been shaken profoundly by violence ever since the death of 17-year-old Naël Merzouk in Nanterre. His grandmother has now spoken, appealing for calm.
The people who are pillaging, stop. They're using Naël as a pretext. No, they must stop. Destroying the shops, the schools, the buses. The mothers take the buses, we take the buses.
Around the town hall in La Île-les-Roses, there is now a ring of barricades and razor wire. This place, like so many in France, is desperately nervous.
Joining me for more on this, Dr. Marco Duranti, Senior Lecturer in Modern European and International History at the University of Sydney. Thanks for your time. How much of a concern this type of violence, and obviously the general protesting and riots is a threat to everyone, but what's been described as an assassination attempt?
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for having me on your program. I just think we should back up for a moment, because I think it's really easy when we hear about these kind of events going on in France to conflate them with what's happened in Australia or what's happened in the United States, for example, with the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. So, of course, there is a global dimension here. But when we're thinking about what happened yesterday, in the case you've mentioned, what's happened over the last week, we have to think about what's uniquely French about all this. I mean, I'm a historian, so that's my job, is to put these phenomena in their national context. And I think we have to look at some of the deeper roots of this phenomenon rather than focus on the day-to-day. We've seen over the last few years, there has been the Yellow Vest movement in late 2018, which was a massive protest against petrol tax. That really involved people from the provinces. It was an overwhelmingly white protest movement and resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 police officers. We've seen more recently massive protests over Macron's pension reforms that have also involved clashes with police officers as well. So if we put all these data points together, what we're seeing in the past week, what we've seen with the Yellow Vest, what we've seen in the case of the pension reform protests, we see something much deeper. It's just a much deeper fissure in French society between the wealthier urban elites and what is happening on the periphery, whether it's the suburbs around Paris, whether it's those in the regions or those affected by these reforms. So I think it's really important here not to think about excusing or apologizing for actions, but looking at the deeper roots of this in order to understand what's happened and how to go forward.
Right, so you allude to there has been for many years in France a lot of racial divide, and and probably an increasing divide around, you know, if you compare it to Australia, where there has been more of a success of multiculturalism. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist here, but so much more segregation, if you like, in lives in France, in people's daily lives, that this shooting was, as what often happens here, was just ended up being the sort of tipping point for what we're seeing at the moment. There was so much tension ongoing already.
Absolutely. So I don't think the shooting was sufficient on its own to cause this kind of conflagration. We have to look at those deeper reasons. You know, in these suburbs that are populated by ethnic minorities, by Black and Arab immigrants, we've seen up to 40% youth unemployment. We've seen decades of economic stagnation, of the difficulty of integrating these groups into French society, of an alienation felt among people in these groups, not feeling fully French. We've seen you know, a lot of very stark differences with Australia. For example, in the banning of religious symbolism in schools. Crucifixes, Muslim headscarves are not allowed under the principles of what the French call the Republican principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality. We've seen the barring of really any discussion about race. It's actually illegal to survey French citizens on their ethnic origins. And a lot of differences in terms of the legal system. You know, in Australia, police cannot require us to issue our identity documents with no grounds. That's possible in France, for example. You know, police have been authorized the last few years to shoot at moving vehicles, which is a response to the horrific terror attacks that happened in 2015. A lot of these tougher security measures are a response to these terror attacks, these concerns around terrorism. But police haven't had the right kind of training. The police themselves have complained about really just having online videos that they've been required to look at rather than any kind of individualized or practical training in these matters as well. So I think it's important to stress some of the differences you mentioned within the kind of ethnic and economic factors here, as well as just the you know, the law and the kind of factors the police have to consider.
So just briefly, and the economic angle is interesting because for all those divides you spoke about, a really well-functioning and fast-growth economy can cover up all sorts of ills because people, you know, always, no matter where they are, what they do, they aspire to a better life. If they feel like they're not going to get that, that's when you can get unrest. And France's economy seems to be struggling to modernise, and even minor reforms are met with such big protests.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. There's been a kind of institutional paralysis that's not just over the last few years, it's over the last few decades, a general sense of decline, a sense that the political class is not capable of resolving these long-standing issues. So that's absolutely part of the problem here.
Marco Duranti, great to get your thoughts.
Great.
About a troubling situation. Thank you.